Hello, everyone. That wonderful piece of music is Selinger's Round. The composer is traditional music. The dance is Selinger's Round or The Beginning of the World. The choreographer is from Playford, the fourth edition. The band is the fabulous folk dance orchestra that we were made aware of earlier this year. Wonderful vintage uh, album. And the musicians, I'm not sure. I couldn't find the information anywhere. So if anyone has that, please post it for us. The CD is Listen to the Band, and I found it at English Folk Dance and Song Society and was really happy to be able to get a copy of it. So um, I suggest you check that out. And here I am. Welcome. I am Darlene Hamilton, and we are the Historical Tea and Dance Society. And woohoo, 2021, we're back. On our team, we have Lindsay Verbal assisting with the program, handling media and our attendee questions. We have Reed Wilson in Zoom handling our questions and posting for us. And on Facebook Live, we have Larry Hansen, and he is posting in the live chat there. And in both places, Reed and Larry are looking for your questions, and we're going to grab them. And if we can't get to them in the show, then we will be answering them in the after talk. So be sure to join us in the after talk. The guests love answering questions. They really do. This is your moment to ask them. So please do. And the After Talk link, if you did not get it by registering already, which is always a great thing to do, and we did have a mistake with it. So make sure you use the updated link, which we'll be posting further on. We will post it towards the end of the show. So make sure you grab it. We're going to post it a few times because I know some of you have been saying it's going by too fast. So keep your eye open for that and always register, and then you'll have it. Well, I already said stick around for the after talk. I'm reading down off my list now. A big thank you to Karen Axelrod and friends. Oh my gosh. Every week, that amazing concert. Thank you, thank you. It makes Tuesday nights so special. We deeply appreciate that, and all of our English country dance musicians. So thank you, thank you. And Karen's going to be on this year. We have a date. It's in February. So yeah. So anyways, we'll talk more about that in weeks ahead. Let me jump into a bio of Daniel Walkowitz. It sounds so formal, Daniel J., but everybody knows him as Danny, and he's wonderful. He is an emeritus professor of both history and social and cultural analysis at New York University. He's worked to uncover and share the history of the people, including the history of labor movements and class. He's written or edited almost a dozen books and 2 dozen articles and helped create 4 films for public television, including Perestroika from Below, a documentary of a miners' strike in Ukraine. He grew up in the international folk dance community and fell in love with English country dance in 1993. As well as being a country dancer and caller, he's on the board of his home group, Country Dance New York. In 2010, New York University Press published his book, City Folk, English Country Dance and the Politics of the Folk in Modern America. What a great read, which analyzes the history of English country dance in the United States from Cecil Sharp to modern times. Please welcome Danny Walkowitz. Yay, we're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Let me thank Darlene and Lindsay in particular for helping to organize this and your wonderful team to make all of this possible.
Thank you.
I also am delighted to see on the participant list a lot of old friends and some new friends. So I look forward to seeing faces that and people who I've been unable to hug for a long time. We've all been able to hug one another. So it'll be nice to see people later.
Yeah, and you'll be able to see that in the after talk. Let's jump right in because I know once we get you going, you've got a lot to talk about. So, thing number 1, personal history, how a nice Jewish boy became infatuated with English country dance.
Well, later I'm going to be actually drawing from my book, but this is not so much from my book. It's really about my own history, and it leads into really the writing of the book, among other things. In truth, I grew up dancing. My parents danced, but they did international dance. And they did it as part of the communist and socialist left. My mother was a socialist. My father was a communist. They got together because there was a period in the Common United Front when socialists and communists talked to one another, and they got married. And so I am what's called a red diaper baby, and grew up going to commie camp. And it was at commie camp where people like Pete Seeger and others were there, came and did folk song. And they taught folk dance. And I did international dance there in the 1950s. My father was a wonderful dancer, and my mother always told me that as she would teach me to do the box step and waltz as I was growing up as a teenager. And so always wanting my mother's pleasure, and always aware of how much she admired my father as a dancer. It mattered to me to be a good dancer, and fortunately, I seem to have at least a reasonable sense of balance, and so did a lot of dancing very early. In fact, as late as or as early as I think 1959, I taught international dance for the first time at one of these left-wing resorts in the the border really of New York and New Jersey. Now not so far from the lower Catskill Mountains. So I started teaching international dance in some ways as early as 1959. Then I went to college, and of course at college I was in a small way a freedom rider. I was a civil rights activist. I was a peace activist. I was involved in the organizing of Students for Democratic Society. I was an English major. My passion was the theater. I did theater from when I was 9 years old until through college. And I was admitted ultimately to go to drama school afterwards, but took a course with a professor who caught my eye, and I liked the things he was doing. He was an historian. He had written an article called The Historian as Playwright, and it merged my interests in history and politics and theater or performance. And so I thought I was going to go to theater school, but instead I became an historian, partially meeting my wife in 1965. We just celebrated our 55th wedding anniversary. It was a nice time we got involved, and I was doing dancing at the university. After the university, there was very little. It was time to write a dissertation and write my book and get tenure. So, but by the late 70s, I decided there was, as I remember saying to some people, life after tenure. And we summered in upstate New York, in Stockbridge, the Lenox area, and there was a folk dance community there. I saw a bulletin board, and I simply went and got re-involved in folk dance. It was run by a man named Carl Finger, whose brother turned out to run one of these left-wing camps that my daughter subsequently went to. So it was a familiar world of left-wing international dancing. There I am in the 70s for folks who have only the kind of present image of me. Those were my hippie days with my daughter on my lap. My daughter, who is now a grown woman of 50 herself and a professor of English literature, and her mate, who was there on a dock. I think we were probably either in Cape Cod or we were in Long Island at a beach house. In any case, so by the late 70s, I started to get involved again in English country, in dance generally, but it was international dance and solely international dance. In the early 80s, I went to Southern California to teach at Irvine and started again doing international dance, but some of the people there doing international dance were doing this new thing called Scandia and got me involved in Scandinavian dance. So I started to do it there, went back to New York and helped to found the Scandinavian dance group in New York. It was the very beginnings really of Scandi dancing in the East Coast. And so I did that for a few years and brought in other people to that dance community, one of whom was Elizabeth Friedman, who's a dance teacher now in the New York community. I'll come back to that in a minute. So in any case, I was doing international and Scandia dance. But I was an historian. My wife was teaching at Johns Hopkins, and she got us an invitation for me to be a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins. I went there and started doing, again, international, some Scandia dancing, but mostly international. And a couple of the international dancers there, a couple of the women, said, you know, we really could use some good male dancers at this other thing at Lovely Lane Church, as I recall, in downtown Baltimore. It was called Contra Dance. Would I go? She said, well, it's going to be like square dancing. I said, well, I knew how to square dance. I guess I can do this. And I went there and I loved it. I loved the music. I loved the twirling. I loved the flair that the people had. But I was a half step behind, but not much more than that, I think. But I quite loved it. Went back to New York. The Scandia Group was then being run by, at that point, by Elizabeth Friedman. And her partner then was a man named Irv Cass. And they said, well, if you love that in Baltimore, you really ought to come to Tuesday night to New York and do some English country dance. So I went along with them. It was, I think, probably February. Arrived there and discovered that I wasn't allowed to dance for the first half hour because you have to pass a test. Well, I must admit, I'm a bit of a snob. I actually think I'm a pretty decent dancer. The idea that I was going to have to pass a test, though, to be fair, I had no idea what English country dancing was like, although one or two dances were part of the international repertoire. But within a week or two, I passed the test right away and I started dancing. And Irv told me that he ran a special, by invitation only, weekend dance in late May and in June. And they always needed good male dancers. And so he invited me to come along. I went. And I will say that the other person who was running that was somebody who was spending her semester in Paris. And she came and arrived with her arm in a sling. It was Mary Kay Friday. And she also ran the dance. And I got in line and she didn't know me from Adam. And her response was, be careful of me, step back. I was really quite put off. I will say that over the next year or two, we became good friends. And I think she recognized I wasn't going to hurt her arm and I could dance. But that was my first and initial interaction with Mary Kay. It was actually a little off-putting. But I started to do English country dance there. One of the dance teachers was Christine Helvig. She liked the way I danced and she encouraged me to do more of it and to join the Chelsea Dancers, which was her performance troupe, which included, by the way, Paul Ross and Sharon Green. Sharon, I think many of you know out on the West Coast, and Paul, I think you've had on this program before. So people will know Paul also. It's, again, one of the finest callers in Manhattan, in New York. So I danced with them and then decided to try calling, and I was invited to do so. I started calling, and I think the class I was in included Robin Hayden and a few other people, 3 or 4 of us, and I started calling in New York, and I was one of the callers there. I did some guest calling in California when I was teaching at Stanford one year, and continued to do that till about 2010, when I decided that there were other people for whom it mattered a lot more, and I was busy writing books, and it was not something I needed to do. I still participate in the community a little bit by teaching the beginners class on occasional Wednesday nights, and I'm happy to be there. But around the same time that I was learning to call, the ECD list had a conversation about the fact that a lot of the grand dames were aging out and what was going to be done to preserve their history. Well, in truth, I'm a dancer, but I'm an historian, and I had done film work. I had already done 2 or 3 films. The film on Perestroika from Below, on the miners in Ukraine, involved the creation of an archive through oral history. So I felt fairly comfortable knowing how to do that. One of the other people, however, who responded on the ECD list was Stephanie Smith at the Smithsonian. She's a folklorist and an archivist, PhD in folklore from Scotland. And she voiced also interest. She teaches in the Washington community. And so we partnered, decided we would get together and I would lend some of the financial support from my university that could help with some of the translating and some of my expenses. And the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where Stephanie was based, also had a videographer, Charlie Weber, and they were prepared to lend him to the project, and he was enthusiastic. So the 3 of us became the basis of a documentation project of English country dance, which began now 21, 22 years ago. And it finished with a film on English country dance and an archive in English country dance. The film follows much of the argument or some of the argument from my book and shares, at least in its main title, the title from my book. And I thought that would be a good segue, really, to giving people a sense of that film, at least from the first minute introduction to it. So I think we should go to thing 2 and perhaps a video clip.
All right. Thing 2. New beginnings, revival and uplift, and a great video clip. I want to see this movie.
And set and swing and men cross left and balance.
I want you to dance with the feeling of look at me, here I am. And as soon as you get that feeling, then you have arrived.
You look around and you see 75 people smiling in Manhattan at the same time. I mean, you just don't see it.
Occasionally people will ask, what do you do in your spare time? And I say that one of the things I do in my spare time is English country dancing. And their general response to that is, what's that?
I believe we must have some conversation, Mr. Darcy.
It's the dancing that was done in the Jane Austen films.
No, I don't ever imagine myself as Darcy. Short, fat and balding, I couldn't possibly be Darcy.
Well, perhaps just a few words about the footage. It ends with a shot of Nicholas Broadbridge, the man who claims he couldn't possibly be Darby, and he's at Pinewoods Camp in that piece of footage. But most of the other footage is at the Lenox Community Center. It is the Freed for All in 1999. That's Frida Metz-Hermann, who was interviewed in that piece. There is our mischievous videographer, Charlie Weber, stuck a shot in of dancing with a strange man in the center with a wig. That's yours truly. And the person in my right hand at that time is actually Robin Hayden in that footage. So there we are. We'll come back and show people a little bit more of that footage a little later into the show. So beginnings. The question really was, with a background in international dance, one of the things that concerned me about thinking about English country dance is that it always seems so very different. One of the things that, again, I'm a pretty political person, as my background in the 60s meant to suggest to a lot of you people. I believe that there's a kind of politics to everything that we do. And I believe there was a politics to the dancing. In international dancing, that was clear. People did international dancing because they imagined themselves doing the dancing of the peoples. So you went to an international dance and there might be 20 dances that evening and they'd be from 15 different countries. And they would be dances supposedly of the people from those countries, plain ordinary people in the spirit of those peoples. And the dances, however, would be expressions of something in the culture. It would be a wedding dance. It would be a funeral dance. It would be a courting dance. And the men in a line would be courting to the women. The women would be courting to the men in the line. And you would feel it in your bodies. You would express it in the way you held your bodies in expressing that dance. When I went to English country dance, I had no sense of that. I couldn't understand. The names of the dances seemed primarily to come from the names of people or trades, like Draper's Gardens, or the names of places for a dance. But they didn't seem, in fact, to be expressions in the choreography of a mood, of a particular event, of an expression. There was nothing about the Drapers that I saw in Draper's Gardens, for instance. To be fair, I think in modern dance, choreographers have begun to invent and give meanings to some dances. I'm not terribly happy with this. It's some of the newer women choreographers who are quite, not choreographers, but callers in New York, who are quite wonderful and quite brilliant at their teaching, have often felt that in order to teach, they can tell a story of the dance. They're making up that story. It is not written in the dance. It was never a part of the dance. I think it's cockamamie. They love it. And the audiences, I think on the whole, tend to enjoy it, and it helps them, give them cues to the expression of the dance. The exception to that, by the way, is Frida Metz-Hermann's evocation of the tides in a dance like Severn Bore. And that's a dance where she self-consciously tried to give you a sense of the tides and the feeling of the dance. But those are exceptions to the ways in which the dances were experienced. So I wanted to try to understand, where does ECD then come from? What's its politics? Well, ECD as we know it is reinvented in the 20th century, in the 19th century. It had earlier existed in America in the colonial period. After all, we were an English country, so there was English country dancing. It largely dies out with quadrilles and waltzes and other couple of other things, quite scandalous things. Waltzes, you put your arm around somebody, and that upset a lot of, quote, people who imagine themselves as respectable. But it largely faded, at least from the ballrooms and of urban ballrooms of the cities. It is recovered in the early 20th century, and the question was why? Well, the origins of that story really are about industrialization. Industrialization required cheap labor, and the sources of that cheap labor were immigrant cheap labor. Lindsay, are we going to have some of these slides now for this?
You bet. Would you like me to start with the immigration slide?
Yes, please.
Wonderful.
There we go. So one of the things that made the immigrants quite different in this period is they were coming from Northern and Southern Europe. They were not the Irish, they were not the English, they were not the Germans. They were Catholics from Southern Italy, and they were Jews and others from Eastern Europe and Russia. They were of a very different sort, and they came in vast numbers. And they populated the cities with these cheap immigrant labor and transformed the nature of the city. The urban conditions were quite horrific, and they lived there was a great deal of urban squalor, all of which was expressed by some of the reformers like Jacob Riis, who provides a book called How the Other Half Lives. There we are. Thank you, Lindsay. That's his book from 1890, which he describes tenement slums. He evoked sympathy for these slums, though it should be noted, he had actually a pretty demeaned view of some of these people themselves. He often blamed their conditions on their behavior rather than on, for instance, bad wages or their own social conditions. But he did document quite wonderfully the conditions that a lot of these people face. However, industrial conditions also transformed opportunities for people and transformed the nature of urban life. So on the one hand, it was creating a lot of anxieties and fears among people because of the impoverished and degradation that they associated with these urban peoples. They also found people engaged in behavior that was increasingly scandalous. Well, they were out on picket lines rather than staying home. Not only were they on picket lines, they were often socialist women handing out broadsheets to encourage people to be socialists. But they weren't home doing cooking for their husbands as traditional nuclear family life in the bourgeois family would have had it. There were new inventions that came along with the garment industry in which a lot of these people worked. Let's come back to that. Let's go to the next one. Bicycles. There we go. So we have women out on bicycles. Again, outrageous public behavior for women. In many of these bicycles, they not only were engaged in this kind of behavior, but they also could be seen smoking cigarettes. What also made some of this possible was the fact that the new garments that were being produced were shirtwaists that no longer required women to have girdles. So they were, what you have are Lindsay, do we have some more of these slides, dear? There we are. There's the photo of the new women, not only wearing knickerbockers and knee socks, but again, not having a girdle. And you might notice in her hand, she's even smoking. So the point of all this is that part of the anxieties that are set loose by this urban industrial movement of rural peoples into the city is the squalor and degradation they associate with these people, the politics of these people, which made them a little anxious. They were joining unions, which made their bosses unhappy, and they were engaged. Increasingly, women were having forms of behavior and activity that were available to them. Two that I should mention that were also made possible by the new forms of industrialization were cinemas and leisure resorts like Coney Island, all of which had were places where people could be engaged in things like the Fun House or the Love Canal, where they could dress up and get engaged in all kinds of behavior that which they couldn't do supposedly in public, but could be sanctioned out in a carnival space. So it was the carnivalesque that was possible in all of these places. So the response for all of this from people who were anxious about it was twofold. About urban squalor on the one hand, it set in motion the desire to deal with cramped classrooms, hungry children. Underground Survival Academy was to deal with an impulse that we can largely associate with creating a white man's burden to civilize a world from which all of these people were coming. So that Teddy Roosevelt is the model for all of this, but what Teddy Roosevelt was really building on was the writing of people like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who gave an address, for instance, at on Memorial Day to the graduating class at Harvard University in 1895, in which he said the following, a very famous address, so famous that Theodore Roosevelt, as a response to it, when he got into power, elevated him to the Supreme Court. The speech he gave was, "I do not know what is true. I do not know the meaning of the universe. But in the midst of doubt, in the collapse of creeds, there is one thing I do not doubt, that no man who lives in the same world with most of us can doubt. And that is that the faith is true and adorable, which leads a soldier to throw away his life in obedience to a blindly accepted duty, in a cause which he little understands, in a plan of campaign of which he has no notion, under tactics of which he does see no use." In other words, one should have blind obedience to a soldier's faith in our leaders. War, he continues, when we're at it, is horrible and dull. But it is only when time has passed that you see that its message was divine. I hope it may be long before we are called again to sit at the master's feet, but some teacher of that kind we all need. We need it in this time of individualist negations. He could have been talking about 2020 to some people's minds, I think, to Tea Party folks, but he was really talking to this world of individualist negations that he was associating with women going out on the street, women engaged in their own behavior. With its literature of French and American humor, revolting at discipline, loving fleshpots, and denying that anything is worthy of reference in order that we remember all that buffoons forget. Out of heroism, he concluded, grows faith in the worth of heroism. The proof comes later and even may never come. Therefore, I rejoice at every dangerous sport which I see pursued. The students at Heidelberg with their sword-slashed faces inspire me with sincere respect. I gaze with delight upon our polo players. If once in a while our rough riding a neck is broken, I regard it not as a waste, but as a price well paid for the breeding of a race fit for headship and command. Teddy Roosevelt is enamored with that rough riding, and he brings his group of people, the Rough Riders, to really a new culture of masculinity, what now we would call toxic masculinity, but at the time was thought to be really a form of Christian masculinity, masculinity for developing men to develop a Christian civilized world. They do that with what it becomes the white man's burden, with Roosevelt and others in the rise really of imperialism. It's not just in the United States, it's the Germans, the English, and the Dutch are all engaged in the 1890s in these ventures really to civilize the world. That's the foreign project. The domestic project was what we would call domestic colonization. And it's to deal with those Italians and those Jews, those Eastern Europeans, who were described in one Baptist press that I was reading in 1898 as not quite white folk altogether. So we're going to come back to that because the ECD list has been obsessed recently with Bridgerton and questions about whiteness in the dance community. And what I hope to make clear today is that the lessons of whiteness are embedded in the long history of how ECD has been taught and remembered. That's not to say that there weren't Black people doing contra dance, as we've seen in some recent videos. It's true. It's not to say that there weren't traditions from Black culture that fed into this, but those traditions were lost in the story that came to be told of English country dance and comes to be lost in the faces on our dance floor. And that story has its roots in the 1890s in this colonial project. The vehicle is the folk revival, settlements, summer camps, scouting, the arts and crafts movement, country song and dance, unsullied by the rigors of urban life that urban life were thought to pursue. We have a few slides that can kind of illustrate some of that. The Scouts will be an important part of this story. We'll come back to this a little later. We'll see that one of the places where Cecil Sharp comes in the United States to teach scouting is a Girl Scout camp run by Helen Starrow, one of the grand dames of early English country dance in the United States. But again, what was the point here? Folklore and anthropology are created in this period, coming out of the 1880s and 1890s, and they see their mission to find, recover, and preserve with these new disciplines imagined to be the solution to urban industrial maladies, not in better wages, not in improved social conditions, but in the vital elements of a simple and pure peasantry that underlaid our modern civilization as they understood it. To remake, they saw their project to remake the immigrant non-English and not quite white immigrants in the cities as respectable, i.e. not socialist, not pro-union citizens. It should be noted that when they then went about doing this early work of recovering the folk, and the earliest person to do this in the United States is going to be Elizabeth Burchinell, we'll come to in a few minutes. Where does she go at the turn of the century? She's an international folk dancer initially. She goes to Eastern Europe and she goes to Northern Europe. She goes to Denmark. She goes to Eastern Europe because the folk were imagined by all these people to be rooted in Eastern and Northern Europe cultures. Folk dance, international folk dance, has almost nothing of Asian dance in it, nothing of African dance in it. They were beyond the ken. They weren't peasants, they were primitives. And the understanding of the origins of civilization came out of this vital, pure peasant culture, which was Northern Europe and Eastern Europe in particular. In fact, we almost have nothing even from places like Italy other than the Tarantella because it was urbanized. So most of the dances are going to be from Greece. They later come from, there'll be some of the Israeli dance, again from Eastern Europeans settling Israel. And otherwise, they're from the Balkans, they're Macedonia, they're Hungarian dances, Chardishes, Polish mazurkas, and they're Scandinavian dances, like some of the Scandia traditions we talked about, and some English dances. So she goes there, and then she goes to see Cecil Sharp, and then she goes to visit Cecil Sharp. So the early project for all of this vehicle is, in fact, the creation of a dance tradition which they can see in Northern and Eastern Europe. And the person who's most responsible, the earliest stages of this, is Elizabeth Burchinell. There she is in her folk dance costume. We have a second shot of her, I think, as well. There she is. One of the things that Elizabeth Burchinell is invited to do by other male leaders, Luther Halsey Gulick and others, is to start teaching folk dancing as physical education. Most of the early folk dancing done in the United States and a lot of the English country dancing is done at in physical education programs and at women's colleges. And that's in good part because they were particularly anxious about women's bodies. Men, they were happy to send and do football, where they could beat up on each other and demonstrate with their scars how male they were. What we needed to do otherwise was to find an alternative for women that would preserve their bodies so they could be fit to be mothers. And in that story, education was thought to be the appropriate way, not too much higher education. They were afraid that would warp their brains, but at least education in teachers' colleges would be appropriate. So Elizabeth Birchnell does that. She forms the Public School Athletic League, and she's teaching a lot of that. And one of the things they begin to do, of course, is maypole dancing. Here's the New York City maypole dance from 1905. Again, you'll see all these young women in white dresses, all about purity and the maypole as the origins of all of this. What was it an alternative to? It was obviously an alternative to a world that was changing, in which alternative forms of dancing were seen to be quite dangerous and upsetting. Those were the dance halls that early slide that Lindsay put up earlier, the ballroom to hell, suggested. That's from 1894. That what's going on in the ballroom were unchaperoned spaces in which bodies were at risk. Something had to be found as an alternative to that, and for that we need thing 3.
Yes,
Darlene,
I
you're
am
up.
coming.
3.
Yep. No, my finger slipped and I missed unmuting.
It's quite all
All
right.
right. Thing 3. Foundational stories, CDSS and CDNY.
So most of you know this story in relationship to Cecil Sharp, but of course, Cecil Sharp is not the first to come or to start this story. We've already mentioned how Elizabeth Birchnell had seen him, and she had gone to the United States, and a few other Americans had gone there as well. And they bring back some of the people they had seen who stimulated them. The one who comes first comes in December of 1910, and it's Mary Neal. So Mary Neal is an extraordinary woman. She has founded, she's a socialist woman who founds the Esperance Girls Settlement in East London to train young girls for sewing and other kinds of activities. But she tried to find a summer activity for them. A Christmas time activity for them, and she taught them dancing, and she ran out of ideas, and she heard about some dance that this guy Cecil Sharp had seen and heard, and so she calls him, and he introduces her to a Morris dancer that he had seen on Boxing Day in 1899, Morris Kimber, and he comes in and shows her Morris dancing, and she starts doing Morris dancing. Well, a couple of years before Cecil Sharp has any interest in doing this. Cecil Sharp, however, sees how successful these dances are and how popular they are. He partners with Mary Neal for a while, and they then have a bit of a falling out. But Mary Neal is the one who is then brought over in 1910 with one of her leading dancers, Florrie Warren. Florrie Warren stays because she marries, and she stays there, and they do Morris dancing, some English country dancing as well, in 1910 and 1911. The person who follows them, however, is A. Claude Wright. There's a lovely example of him coming. Actually, it's a picture that's in my book, and it displays the kind of verticality for the Morris dancing that he did. He was an extraordinary dancer. And he comes in 1913 and 1914 at the invitation of one of these Boston Angliophiles, a Harvard professor, George P. Baker, who taught Shakespeare, among other things, and who had attended the Stratford Summer School, where both Mary Neal and Cecil Sharp had taught. And while Mary Neal was teaching there in 1011, Cecil Sharp goes out of his way and takes over the Stratford School and basically wipes out Mary Neal. In fact, when she came to the United States, she found all of her gigs had been canceled, and she had to go about reconstructing some of them. So there was a lot of not very pleasant competition between some of these early callers. In any case, Claude Wright is enormously successful. Teaches with Morris dancing, some sword dancing, country dancing, teaches it in Boston in particular with Helen Storrow, but in particular with George Baker, one of his summer programs. But the war breaks out, and he's encouraged, not very subtly, by Cecil Sharp to enlist in the war, among other things because then Sharp can replace him and come to the United States. The exchanges there are a little bitter, and I would suggest to people who want to get a kind of inside look at Sharp's views on a lot of these things, you can go and read the Sharp letters. They're all in the Sharp collection that's online at the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library in Cecil Sharp House, and you can read a lot of those quite extraordinary exchanges and letters. In any case, Sharp arrives in December 1914, just before Christmas. Those are his dancers, really, the people who dance with him in this country. You can see especially large numbers of young women and some young men. You'll notice the large number of African Americans and Asians in the group. Not. It is, again, it is an Anglophile white group. That's who we are doing this dancing. One of the differences, perhaps, from the dance floor today is they're not quite as long in the tooth as many of us are. And we'll need to deal with that, obviously, later in our conversation. In any case, Sharp arrives and starts teaching and realizes there's both money to be made and there's interest in the dancing. And there's enormous fascination with this as a way to train and teach people with respectable bodies. He's got to get the ballet movements out of the dancers' bodies. So he's often complaining that their embodiments are too balletic, but he starts to teach them dance, and then helps to organize in March of 1915 the American branch of the English Folk Dance and Song Society. So that's really the origins of what then becomes the Country Dance and Song Society of America. It starts as the American branch. Its main branch is New York and in Boston. Later, it begins to develop a couple of other branches in places like Pittsburgh and a few other cities. Sharp goes around. He teaches at some of the women's schools. He's only a little leery. He doesn't want to get too involved with the feminists who are there. He was at best he was somewhere between being anti-feminist and mildly tolerating feminist. His sister, you might be interested in knowing, was a suffragette. She was jailed in a hunger strike, and Cecil Sharp was not overly sympathetic to her causes. In any case, Sharp spends much of the next few years traveling in the mountains, collecting with quite an extraordinary job, collecting song and some dance. He does this with one of his dancers from his original dance troupe. The men in that dance troupe, I think 4 of them are killed in World War I, but some of the women survive, and one of them, of course, is Maud Carpeles, who is known in the text as she helps to write his biography. It's really a hagiography. It's very laudatory. It's written in 1933 and republished in 1967, simply called Cecil Sharp. There's Maud Carpeles there sitting to the right of Cecil Sharp. Lily Roberts is the teacher he brings over to teach and lead English country dance in the United States. She marries Conant. She becomes Lily Roberts Conant, and will later inherit the Storrow's money, and that becomes the founding, really, of Pinewood's dance camp. But we get ahead of ourselves for a minute. Sharp spends an enormous number of 3 or 4 years, the better part of 3 years, in the South. It's an extraordinary job of collecting that he does. This really regal, one might think almost stuffy guy, does a wonderful job and collects these dances. He brings in teachers from across the country. By the way, the dance that he teaches first and foremost in all of this is the one that you heard at the beginning, Sellinger's Round. And I particularly wanted you to hear that because it's a mid-16th century dance. It is not a Playford dance. It's recorded by Playfords, but its origins are thought to be not in the regal dances of the later Playford, not in the aristocratic traditions, but rather in the maypole dance. They are dances that are then done from the village green and from, he liked to think the peasantry. The English didn't have a peasantry, really. They had working people in the village green. And I mean that only to suggest how much the origins of our dance really were heterogeneous. They were partially aristocratic, but they had a firm foot in a lot of the early dances that were from the village green, a tradition I would argue has largely been lost in much of the dancing that we do today. In any case, Starro brings Lily Roberts to teach the dancing. He teaches dancing at the Girl Scout camp. I mentioned that Helen Starro's run. She's one of the founders of the Girl Scouts in the United States. And Starro is, again, a very wealthy philanthropist. Her husband is a major player, a businessman, a very wealthy man. I think he was in the, I don't remember, Gene Morrow will remember. I've lost my own memory on all of this, whether he was in General Electric or Auto or whatever, but a wealthy guy. She had her own money. General Motors. Thank you, Gene. Thank you. And in any case, she brings him there to the Girl Scout camp, and that Girl Scout camp, when she dies, is then willed to Lily Conant, and it becomes the basis of Pine Woods in 1934. What we have is a dance tradition going forward out of the 20s, which remains pretty unchanged for the next 20 years. They're all elite Anglophiles, women who revere sharp, not feminists. They take dances and their songs from the village green and the gentry, but they take them into the drawing rooms where they're performed in fancy dress and dressed up. And that's the tradition. We see some of it. I think we have the nice shot from the Amherst summer camp that's on the cover of my book that you can see. Again, it's a brilliant shot that's very, very well known in terms of the dancing bodies, but it's, again, they're all young white Anglophiles, and that's the dance tradition that moves forward into the 1970s when things change dramatically. And that is where we come to Figure 4.
Did we have a video we were going to show here?
Oh, yes, we should have. We were going to show it earlier, and I think we should show it because I know you'd love to see it.
Absolutely. And yeah, good.
Let's do that now.
English country dance is an opportunity for a group of people to make patterns in space and time. It usually organizes the people into lines of women facing lines of men, and those lines figure together, move up and down the floor in the space to a tune that's repeated over and over again, and figures that are repeated over and over again, but always the music is slightly different.
The tunes are beautiful, and I think more than any other form of dance I know, those particular tunes will be set to a dance, or the dance is set to the tune, and the best dances, the fit is like this.
When you arrive at the point where you take your partner's hand just on the beat.
Just on the beat, and you both know, or not on the beat, but just at the moment.
Really spliffy.
English country dance today is a construction that in part samples past practices of dancing from English society as early as 1651. This dancing practice done by people of the gentry or aspiring to the gentry was recovered again at the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century by a folk dance revival in England. And this, one of the leader of this is Cecil Sharp.
So just a couple of quick notes just to everybody. That's Pine Woods Dance Camp. It's 1999 when we shot that footage. Yes, you did see Freed dancing. You also saw Helena Cornelius dancing, and dancing with Cornelius in her hand. It's Helena and Arthur dance is Mary Kay. Mary Kay Fridays in that quite a bit. The person who we interviewed who's speaking there is one of my favorite historians from Southern California. It is Linda Tomko, and her book Dancing Class, Gender, Ethnicity, and the Social Divides in American Dance from 1890 to 1920 is a wonder to read, and I strongly recommend it to all of you. So let's move on to thing 4, if we may.
Great. Thank you. Thing 4, the 1970s an reimagined community?
Well, I think Jean Morrow has been on here has been on the set before and has shared with you something of what he shared with me about how dancing changed dramatically in the 1960s. I know of that transition myself, but not in terms of the English country dance community. And he's spoken how that world changed with the coming of the counterculture, the back to the land hippies. You saw a picture of me as one of those, as it were, back to the land hippies, though I'm a very thorough bourgeois. But my daughter lived on a hippie commune, which she got eventually thrown in jail for manufacturing marijuana. So, you know, that was a world I knew pretty well and danced in. And in that world, everybody was doing contra dance in the backwoods. The contra boom, as Jean has pointed out and I think described, brought New England country dance and mountain dance traditions really into Pinewoods and into the dance community. It's worth noting, however, that dancing through at least into the 70s, Beverly Francis and I were teaching dance, did a dance together in the 70s, in the early 21st century, around 2008, I think, in which she suggested we would replicate what a dance had been like in the 70s. And the program for that dance was contra dance, square dance, English country dance, and traditional dance all together. Not unlike, by the way, what it would be like to dance at Cecil Sharp House at what be any of their beginners Thursday night classes to this day in England. So something changes quite dramatically by the 1980s in the country dance community. And the stimulus for that are three things we probably could say. One is the contra boom generally, it's been described. Second are the new young people who come to that contra boom. People who are coming out of backwoods, they're young people, they're coming with a different set of mores. So people have talked about how May Gadd had a bush patrol because she was concerned about what people were doing in the backwoods and whether there was hanky-panky going on. You get a sense that May Gadd contrasts rather dramatically with one of the most important young dancers in the middle of the 1970s. And that is, let's go to our next slide. Carl, to Carl. Okay, everybody knows who this is, Carl Whitman. So the irony, of course, is Carl Whitman is very important in the dance community for the creation of gender-free dancing. But what's equally important is that Carl Whitman, which was not as well known in the dance community, in fact, is much better known internationally for being one of the founders of the gay liberations movement in the United States and having written one of the pioneering manuscripts for that, the Gay Manifesto, which was published. And that's one of the most important documents really in American history. And Carl authors that, quite apart from all the work that he subsequently did. But what the Carl Whitman that many of us know, of course, is in the next picture that we're going to see, also from my book. And there you are. And what I like about this, of course, this is the dancing on the front lawn in Wolf Creek, Oregon. But again, these are the country dancers, barefoot and bearded. They do not look like the dance floor that May Gadd would have populated. It certainly does not look like Amherst in 1927. The world had been transformed. So it is being transformed by the contra boom. It's being transformed by a new set of people in the dance, including people who are rethinking the fundamental heterosexual culture of the dance tradition. And it's being rethought by the arrival in 1974 at Pinewoods of Pat Shaw, who was also the third important figure in this story. And I think what's important about Pat Shaw was not only that he begins to blur some of the lines about what was thought to be English country and what was American dance in the choreography, but he gives license to people to write dances anew, to create, as it were, a living tradition to the dance. But he makes it possible also for people to acknowledge a dance tradition which has been invented by or reinvented by Pat Shaw, and he can even begin to challenge whether it was reinvented correctly or incorrectly as he begins to rethink what siding was like or not like So we all know that we teach siding as Pat Shaw siding or Cecil Sharp siding, because there were different notions about from Shaw, the way in which Shaw was reading those early Playford books as to what was appropriate. But he also makes it possible for people to begin to write a whole set of new books. And what emerges out of that is a new form of dance, which I call modern English country dance. Jean Murrow and I at one point went and contrasted some of the thank you, Jean, we need to correct the spelling. That was probably my doing, no C. One of the things we did with Jean and I, we timed some of the early dances, the early recordings from the early 20s with the more modern recordings, and the tempo had changed dramatically. The dances were being done much more quickly and rapidly earlier with much more energy. And they became, in the modern form, they become, in fact, predominantly, the predominant dance form is the waltz dance form, which is as a waltz, not 3/4 time. It is much more bouncy, it is schmaltzy and lyrical. And that is the modern invented dance tradition of the modern dance community that's created. Slower, languorous, waltz time, schmaltzy. The people doing this are white ethnics. Now, that's also now what begins to change. The new people who come to this community are not just young. They are people like moi and like Jean Murrow, whose background is Jewish. Worth noting at this point that Jean argues and says that his sense when he came into the community in the 1960s, that his sense was that earlier it was faintly, if not explicitly, anti-Semitic. It obviously has not become so, because in the words of one of the more important books in American history, Jews have become white folks. That's to say, there was a way in which, through assimilation, at least increasingly, Jews began to assimilate and take on some of the characteristics where they would not be seen as a not quite white folk other and could be merged. So our community now has Italians, and it has Jews, it has Eastern Europeans in it. It has the folks who were who needed to be made respectable. Well, lo and behold, I guess we've been made respectable. But it's meant that there's a new form of whiteness in the present community. But of course, the piece of all that is we've aged in the tooth, which brings us to a few last words about the last piece of all of this, which is thing 5.
Thing 5. Withering English country dance.
So as Sharon and David Green know well from the time we used to spend together in the car going to teach dancing in Ridgewood, I love to pun, and I like words that have multiple meanings. And I think one of the tragedies about and problems, at least for the modern community, is that we are withering, we are getting longer in the tooth. And so therefore one asks, where is the community going? What will be its future? I wish I could say I had a magic answer to that, and in the Q&A we can begin to talk about all of that. But of course, it was raised in relationship to places like Bridgerton and race. Well, what I can say is that first we need to acknowledge that traditions have been invented and are always being reinvented, and that in the original invention, we invented out any of the non-white origins of this dance community. So it's clear, for instance, that some of the songs that Sharp was hearing in the Southern Mountains, maybe even the running set and the other forms, there were German elements in them. There were probably African-American elements in all of those dance traditions as well. American culture has never been created as pure white, as some would have it. And then secondly, it may be that the 21st century ECD community maybe needs to try to return to the format of earlier days, which always did bring younger dancers into the community, which means combining American and English, bringing in a traditional rants, squares, hornpipes. Yes, some of the older dancers will sit them out. Well, I'm reading in the Times that 4-second bursts of energy are really good for our health. I think actually a little ranting might be what we all need, especially in these COVID times. But in fact, if it may mean that we all have to put some of our preferences, at least on a back burner occasionally during the course of an evening, in order to create a more diverse community that has to be diverse in its teaching and the kinds of things that we do. So that's where we are in the end of our section. And I think we're rounding into 9 o'clock. We could even invite, by the way, Morris and sword teams to perform.
Wow. What a great talk, Danny. Thank you so much. And I am really looking forward to joining in the after talk and getting so many of these questions asked and hearing the responses. Thank you so much. We are going to post info. Oh, there he is. He'll be back. We're going to post some information about Danny's latest book. And also in our 5 Things Dropbox, we have a suggested reading list, and many of these books and people that were mentioned along the way are listed on that. So Larry and Reed are going to post the link for the 5 Things Dropbox. Make sure to save your chat if you can, or just copy it and grab it out. We do have questions, but we're going to get to them in the after talk. As you know, oh, he snuck away before listing what his favorite dance was. I guess we'll have to bring that into the after talk. Anyways, thank you, Danny Walkowitz, for being, oh, he came back. He's going to tell us what his favorite dance is.
Oh, I have, many favorite dances, but I think the one I think I suggested that you want me to have my video back on?
Might be nice while you're talking.
Yeah, there I am. I don't know why. I don't know how it quite got off, to be honest. I like St. Margaret's Hill. It's it's a lyrical dance that I've always enjoyed an enormous amount. There are very few dances that I don't enjoy and don't find some pleasure in. Some of the older dances and some of the new, as well as some of the newer dances. And you asked me about the music I like, but in truth, there is no music I don't like. Much like I can tell people when they put on dance, I'll dance to anything. It can be English country dance. I'll put on a waltz. I'll do a jitterbug. I'm happy to do tango, virtually anything. I just love to dance. And so music as well. I like, classical stuff. Dvorak, the New World Symphony, and Beethoven, the Ninth Symphony,
Yeah.
All of those kinds of things. But so shall we go and adjourn to the other room?
Well, I am going to do the wrap up, but yes, you're welcome to take a break and leave, and we will be opening that up in just a couple of minutes as soon as the music is over. But first, let me make some announcements for our group and everything else. Thank you again, Danny, for being with us. Thank you to my 5 Things team, Lindsay Verbal in the background on Zoom, Reed Wilson, Larry Hansen on Facebook, along with our helpers, Kara King and Dan Vilter. Colin Hume maintains an accessible index of all our web chats on his website in one place, and we're posting that. Please go and check out the list of now 44 plus this one web chats we've had on since March 2020. A big thank you to people who have been donating to our group. There are operational expenses, and this is the way we bring in money. So right now to help pay the costs. So thank you very much. We are posting the After Talk link. I'm sure it's already been posted once. We are going to keep posting it again next week, January 12th, Tuesday. Wayne Hankin. Wayne is a wizard at woodwinds that date before 1750. We're going to post a little bio about him, a little blurb about him. He's a wonderful performer and entertainer, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Registration is now open. Thursdays, we have tea time. And, I accidentally clipped out my own post about this Saturday. We have a very few spaces left in a Susan DeGuardiola Regency Masquerades lecture, and anyone who's been to her talks know they're very exciting, a lot of fun. They always sell out, so if you're interested, make sure you go to our website and pick up those tickets right away. And then on January 30th, we are going to have a Regency era music concert. We are not going into the music business, but we are going to have this with Bruce Teeter and the Piccadillys on historical instruments, the way it might have sounded and been at a Regency era afternoon or ball. So we hope you will join us for that. We'll be posting more information as that goes on. The donation link, donations according to Danny, should be directed to your own local dance group, and I'm sure they need them. So our exit music is the fabulous Mary Kay by Dave Weisler, and we will see you all in 2 minutes. Bye.